Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. Today I thought I'd do an episode on flashlights. And I am going to review some specific flashlights in this episode, but more than anything, I wanted to tell you a story. The story of my experiences with flashlights, which really serves to highlight just how much advanced light-emitting diode technology has revolutionized flashlight technology and turned something that previously was not good for much of anything into an indispensable survival tool. Now, back when I was a kid, not so many decades ago, a flashlight was about that long and about that big around, had a maximum light output of maybe 10 or 12 lumens, ran on 2 D-cell batteries that if you were lucky would last an hour or maybe 2, and if you dropped the thing on a plush carpet it would probably die. Granted, there were like the original Maglights and some other flashlights that were a little better built, a little more durable, a little more impact resistant, but their other performance characteristics were still similar. And so in that day and age, a flashlight really was not all that useful. I mean, you couldn't use it for portable reading because, one, it was a little big to carry around as a reading light, and two, if you were going to read for very long in the dark, you better have a whole backpack full of D-cell batteries, which most people didn't want to carry around, including myself. Now, as for walking in the dark, I remember an incident when I was in my early adolescence at a summer youth camp where a bunch of us guys, in fact everybody in my cabin, decided to go for a hike in the dark. And it wouldn't have been so bad if it hadn't been for that one guy who brought the flashlight. Because you take one of those flashlights from that era and you shine it out in front of you and it's so dim that the light just disappears. You know, you can't see where you're going. And so to see anything, you got to bring it down pretty close to your feet where you just have this one little bright spot on the ground that doesn't really show you enough of the terrain in front of you to help you see where you're going. All it does is it keeps your eyes from adjusting to the darkness, and so it actually prevents you from seeing where you're going. And I remember on this thankfully short hike as we're stumbling along through the woods, tripping over rocks and branches and whatever else was out there, just wishing that that guy would turn off the stupid flashlight. And so throughout my adolescence and early adulthood, I regarded flashlights as something that just were not very useful. Now, those old flashlights did have their one niche of applicability, and that was for roadside emergencies. You know, if you were out driving at night and you got a flat tire, you had to change a tire in the dark, or you had to check something under the hood, or whatever the case might be, a flashlight was better than nothing. If nothing else, at least carrying the flashlight as you were walking around your vehicle on the shoulder of the road made you more visible so that you weren't likely to be run over by other motorists in the dark. And so, about the time I started driving, my mother gave me a 12.5 lumen typical double D-cell task force flashlight, which I put in the toolbox of my truck and didn't look at for several years thereafter. Well, it came to pass after I was in college, and incidentally after LED flashlights had already started to gain some initial popularity, though I hadn't paid much mind to that I was out driving after dark and I got a flat tire. So I had to change a flat tire in the dark, and for the first time in my life, a flashlight actually came in somewhat useful. Well, a couple weeks after that, I was in a hardware store, and I happened to notice up by the cash register they had, you know, a rack full of flashlights that they were selling, and they had the exact flashlight model that I kept in my truck, the 12.5 lumen task force light. And right next to it, they had a new high-performance LED flashlight made by the same company, another task force light, that was rated for 130 lumens. Remember, the one I had was only 12. And this other light was not all that expensive. I think it was about $35 at that time. So I went ahead and bought it, figuring if nothing else it would be a good replacement for the light that I kept in my truck. And I tried it out, and compared to the lights that I'd seen before, it was unbelievably bright. It was so bright that I could walk into a totally dark room indoors, shine it on the ceiling, and be able to see everything in the room, just from the light reflecting off the ceiling. And so I was so enamored with a flashlight that was actually bright enough to be useful that even though it was a C-cell flashlight, it was kind of big in retrospect, I made a holster for it and I started carrying it around. And I found out just how useful carrying a flashlight around can be when you've got a flashlight that's bright enough to see what's out in the distance and runs long enough that you don't have to replace the batteries very often. Well, after carrying this thing around in a leather holster on my belt like some big old tie-down revolver for several years, and incidentally, I had a lot of people over those years point to this thing kind of sticking out from under my vest and ask if it was a handgun, which I might also have been carrying at the time, but this wasn't it. Anyway, one day I was in a sporting goods store and I happened to see a Streamlight ProTac 2L. Now, this is kind of an expensive flashlight, at least for a cheapskate like me. It cost about $45, but I looked at the specifications on it, and this little thing is rated for 260 lumens. This one was 130. So this is fully twice as bright and a quarter of the size. What's more, this had multiple brightness settings. You can adjust the brightness. It had a high and a low setting. High was 260 lumens. Low was about 13 lumens, so comparable to one of those old D-cell flashlights. What was significant about that is that on low, it was rated to run for 50 hours. That could be useful in some certain situations. I mean, you can read for a long time if you've got a 50-hour battery life, and so if you get stuck in a storm out in the mountains, you're stuck in a tent, got nothing to do and not much light to read by, that could come in really handy. I think the battery life on 2 C-cells was about 6 to 8 hours in this flashlight. So after contemplating the advantages of a more sophisticated LED flashlight, I reluctantly shelled out the $45 and bought one of these. And after carrying it around for a little while, I was so impressed with its performance that I went back and bought another one to keep as a backup. Now, just about a year ago, I started having some intermittent problems with these Streamlights. And, I'd go to turn the thing on, and I'd press the button and sometimes it wouldn't come on. Or I'd press the button and it wouldn't come on, but I'd shake it and then it would come on. And so I wasn't sure if it was a loose connection, if something was just dying, or what the problem was. Eventually I found out the problem had nothing to do with the flashlight. The flashlight was doing great, it was the batteries that were the problem. I'd gone and bought some cheap generic brand rechargeable CR123As, and they were failing randomly. I'm not sure exactly what it is, what the failure mechanism is in these flashlight or in these batteries, such that they start to die, and if you shake them, you can sometimes restore functionality. But the bottom line is the batteries were dying randomly, and once I put some good quality batteries in it, the flashlight resumed superlative functionality. However, while I was still in the process of diagnosing that problem, and while I was thinking that there was something wrong with these Streamlights, I started doing a little more research and looking around at some of the available options now that I knew that there were a lot of high-performance LED flashlights on the market, now that the technology had been out for a while and more companies were starting to introduce more cost-effective alternatives. I started doing a little exploring, so to speak, and I wanted to share with you some of the results of my comparisons and testing and experimentation. Now, one of the first flashlights that I tested was this little NRA tactical light that I got off the NRA store. It cost about $25. After testing it out, I discovered that that was basically a $20 donation to the NRA and a $5 flashlight, which is okay. I support the NRA. But the fact is, this was rated for 100 lumens output on high. I built a measuring circuit to test the light output, and I wasn't getting more than about 65 lumens actual output on the highest setting. It is a fairly useful reading light. You set it on low, and then when the battery starts to decline in charge, you turn it up to high, and so you can get probably 15 to 30 hours of reading time out of it. I read a fairly substantial novel on 2 AA batteries with it. So it has its uses, especially if you feel like donating to the NRA, but it's definitely not a replacement for the Streamlight. Another flashlight that I tested out was this Energizer flashlight. Now, this has got to be the Zen master of flashlights. It is so perfectly balanced that it isn't good for anything. And, I can just picture the engineers back at Energizer Corporation designing this flashlight. They wanted to maximize brightness, maximize runtime on 2 AA Energizer batteries. They wanted to keep the cost down. They've got a whole list of functional requirements and objectives, and so that what they probably did is they came up with some kind of quality function deployment matrix that allowed them to numerically assess different options, and so they could select the optimal LED to use in the flashlight and the optimal control circuitry, and so on and so forth to make the best overall flashlight given their functional requirements. And in an academic sense, they really did their homework. In some ways, this is a very impressive flashlight. Recall this task force flashlight that I carried around for years. Has an output of about 130 lumens, runs on 2 C-cell batteries, cost about $30, and runs for about 8 hours on those 2 C-cell batteries. This Energizer flashlight that I bought much more recently runs on 2 AA batteries, so it's much smaller, much easier to carry around. It only cost about $15, so half the cost of this. It's rated for 100 lumens output, but based on my measurements, it's actually more like 130, at least when the batteries are fresh. So essentially the same brightness output. And the runtime is incredible. In my testing, this flashlight ran for 45 hours before it got too dim to comfortably read with. So if I bought this flashlight 10 years ago, I would have been very impressed. Now, after owning the Streamlight, not so much. And the reason I say that is, I found that for walking around outside, I really like at least 250 lumens. If you've got 250 lumens or more, you can have a wide enough beam to really see kind of the ground out in front of you, and yet it's still bright enough out far enough that you can see the terrain out in front of you. And so, you can see what you're walking on, and you can see what you're walking into. You can see where you're walking and where you're going. And so, for walking around outdoors, 100 lumen light like this, or 130 lumen light, it's somewhat useful. It's certainly a big step up from the flashlights of my childhood, but it's really doesn't quite cut it, in my opinion. And at the same time, 130 lumen light reflecting off of a white page 6 inches in front of your face is blindingly bright. So you can't really use this for reading. You can't really use it for walking around outdoors, or it's certainly a suboptimal choice for that. What's it good for? I mean, I suppose if you're one of those crazy people that likes to get up 2 hours before sunrise and go jogging in the dark, You could carry it to make yourself visible and keep from getting run over by oncoming cars. But, I don't really see a lot of good applications for this flashlight in spite of all the design effort that I'm sure went into optimizing its performance. Yet another flashlight that I considered was this Mini-Maglight LED Pro. And here at last we have a real competitor with the Streamlight. The Maglight is rated for 275 lumens output. Based on my measurements, with fresh batteries, it's more like 375. So it's a very bright little flashlight, if you can see that there. It runs on 2 AA batteries, which is somewhat of an advantage because AA's are a lot cheaper and a lot easier to find than the CR123As like the Streamlight uses. It's about a $25 to $30 flashlight compared to the Streamlight is $45 to $50. So it has a number of advantages. Now, it also has a number of weaknesses, or I should say the ProTac 2L, the Streamlight, has a number of advantages. For one thing, this is a single mode flashlight, so it only has the one brightness setting, meaning, for walking around outside, it's great. For reading, it's not well suited to that application, both because, one, it's blindingly bright, two, even if you just reflect it off the ceiling and read with the secondary light, which you could certainly do, the battery life at that brightness level is not great. I think it ran for about 2 hours on one change of batteries. So the battery life is not as good as the Streamlight, especially for applications that don't necessarily require full brightness. It's not quite as ergonomic as the Streamlight. The Streamlight has the tail cap switch, whereas the Maglight still uses their traditional design where you rotate the lens cap until the flashlight comes on, which may be somewhat a matter of preference, but I certainly find the Streamlight more ergonomic in that sense. At the same time, given the price difference, are the marginal advantages of the Streamlight worth the price difference? It's 6 to 1, half a dozen to the other. These are both very good lights. So one thing to keep in mind, though, is if you're looking for a Maglight, make sure it's the LED Pro series. Maglight still makes a lot of their tried and true, or from my perspective, tried and obsolete flashlights. So you want to make sure you get the one that has the new LED technology in it. For that matter, if you're shopping for a Streamlight, you want to make sure you get the ProTac 2L, because I've heard, I haven't owned any of the other models, but I've heard some poor reviews, especially of the ProTac HL, which is similar to this. It's a little bit bigger. I think it runs on the same batteries, but it has a higher brightness output. It has about a 750 lumen high beam, at which level it doesn't run nearly as long. It depletes the batteries much faster. And yet, in my experience, 250 to 350 lumens is really all you need. Above that, it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. So the functional difference between a 260 lumen beam like this and the 750 lumen beam of the HL is minimal, and yet you get a lot less runtime with the brighter flashlight. So I do recommend the 2L over the HL and the Streamlights. And I've also heard some other reviews online that have cast a very negative light on the ProTac HL, for just in terms of reliability issues and surface finishes, and I forget what all else. I'm not sure if those reviews are necessarily credible, but that's what I've heard. Now, I also tested a couple of Ultrafire flashlights, which maybe I should refer to as generic brand flashlights, because I've seen the same flashlight sold under names like Windfire, Tangfire, you name it fire, and even a few brands that don't include the word fire. This one also has the Cree logo on it, which is probably a trademark infringement because these do not use genuine Cree LEDs. Cree is a genuine company that makes a lot of high-performance LEDs, LEDs that are used in a lot of high-performance flashlights. These, however, do not use Cree LEDs. These are also grossly overrated in terms of their brightness. This one was rated for 300 lumens, maximum output. Based on my measurements, it's more like 50 to 65. So, I'm a little concerned about their false advertising. Beyond that, the construction does look a little bit flimsy. It's got this variable focus apparatus on the front that just slides back and forth, and I'm concerned that with a little bit of wear that could probably slip right off. So it's not the kind of flashlight that I'd want to throw in my truck and have to depend on 5 years down the road when I have to change a tire in the dark, because by that time, if it's been bounced around a little, it'll probably be in pieces back there. Now that said, these flashlights sell for $2 to $4 on Amazon.com, and they usually include free shipping, which is fortunate because they ship all the way from mainland China. And I would think it would cost more than $2 to ship something, across the Pacific Ocean. So it almost seems like they're paying you to take their flashlight, which is really the only reason that I thought it was worth testing. Anyway, so the Ultrafire, definitely they're engaging in some false advertising. Dirt cheap flashlight, is it worth the price? Yeah, maybe, but don't expect a high quality flashlight if you're buying Ultrafire. Actually, like I said, I got two Ultrafires. That little one that was $2, and then this bigger one that's I think it was 10 or 15. This one was rated for 1600 lumens output. Based on my measurements, it would be lucky to achieve 400. So, once again, in case of false advertising, this one does appear to be a little bit better built, at least in terms of its sturdiness. It's got the same sliding focus mechanism at the front, but it's a little bit tighter, not as sloppy. One interesting thing about these Ultrafire flashlights is the way their focus mechanism works. It gives you, anywhere from a very broad beam down to an image of the LED that's actually square. If you can see that, I don't know how well that shows up on the camera, but you can see, basically a focused image of the LED. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a good thing, but it's kind of an interesting quirk of these flashlights. They're the only brand I know of that gives you a square beam. Another interesting quirk about them that incidentally confirms my suspicion that they do not use genuine Cree LEDs is the fact they have a little bit different color than any other flashlight on the market. All the other high-performance flashlights you buy are basically white. These are almost white, but they have kind of an unusual lavender or purplish tint. So I'm not sure what causes that, but I think the root cause is that they're using probably reverse engineered LEDs made in China based on stolen information from Cree or from some other LED company, who knows. Anyway, now given that this puts off 400 lumens, which is a fairly usable amount of light, for $15, this is not a bad flashlight. I kind of hate to admit it because I'm a little sore about their false advertising, and that makes me suspicious about the quality of these lights in general. But for a $15 flashlight, the performance is really not all that bad. The runtime on this flashlight, though, is definitely not very good. It uses two rechargeable 18650 batteries, and out of those you get about 1 hour of runtime on full brightness, or if it does have a reduced brightness setting, so if you turn it down and you're just using it for reading, you could use it for maybe 6 hours. based on my testing. So, you know, once, I guess, beware of the Ultrafire brand. You know, don't believe anything they say, but their XML-T6 model, for what it costs, is actually not such a bad deal. Now, the final flashlight that I would like to discuss today is the Thrunite TN-12. This is a relatively expensive flashlight, $45 to $50, so basically identical in price to the Streamlight ProTac 2L. The TN-12 has 5 brightness modes, beginning with a very low setting of 0.3 lumens, and then variable to 20 lumens, 280 lumens, 800 lumens, and 1050 lumens. Now, the top 2 of those modes are really more novelties than anything else. You know, they are visibly brighter than the 280 lumen setting, but they don't really let you see that much further or that much more of your surroundings, and so, you know, and they reduce your battery life considerably. So realistically, if I'm carrying this thing outside, I'm going to be running it on 280, at which point I get about 6 hours of runtime on one 18650 battery. Now, the low brightness modes are actually very useful. You know, the 20 lumen mode is very comparable to the 13 lumen mode on the Streamlight, as I've already discussed. And that very low mode, 0.3 lumens, is right about the minimum luminosity that can be used effectively for reading. And on that mode, the flashlight is rated to run continuously for 66 days. Now, I didn't actually test that independently. You know, I didn't independently verify that runtime because 66 days was kind of a long time to wait for the battery to run down. However, given that the rated runtime on 280 lumens was 5 hours, and that it ran for 6 in my test, I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt on that one and figure, you know, if their rated runtime on the medium setting is, if anything, conservative, then their rated runtime on the lower setting is probably also accurate or even conservative. One thing to note about the Thrunite is that it comes in 2 colors, namely cool white and neutral white. Now, I've seen other LED flashlights that are slightly, you know, have a slight bluish tint to the coloration of the light. Most of them are just plain white. Well, and then there's the Ultrafires that have a weird purplish tint. But anyway, most of them are either just plain white or have a slight bluish tint. And I assumed that the cool white was that bluish tint, and neutral white was just plain white. Actually, it turns out that what Thrunite calls cool white is what I would call neutral white. It's just an ordinary white flashlight. Whereas what they're referring to as neutral white is actually more of a pale yellowish color. So just something to be aware of if you happen to be looking into buying a Thrunite flashlight. So in my mind, the big advantage of the Thrunite TN-12 over the Streamlight ProTac 2L is runtime. The TN-12 will run for 6 hours at 280 lumens versus 3 hours at 260 lumens for the ProTac 2L. So you get about double the runtime. The big advantage of the Streamlight ProTac 2L over the Thrunite TN-12 is smaller size. You know, this one weighs about half as much as this one does. You can see the size difference. You know, the Streamlight is just smaller. It's easier to fit in a pocket to carry around. Now, personally, I don't mind carrying the larger Thrunite TN-12, and I like the longer runtime. So for the time being, this is the flashlight I'm carrying. However, bear in mind that I also don't mind carrying around a full-size 44 Magnum. So take that for what it is. Anyway, that's the story of my experiences with flashlights, culminating in this recent quest to find the ultimate light for everyday carry, which for now is the Thrunite TN-12, but really it's a toss-up between the Thrunite TN-12, the Streamlight ProTac 2L, and the Maglight Mini-Mag Pro LED. You know, which of these three you choose really depends on a matter of preference. Any of the three seem to me like really good lights for LED carry. Anyway, thanks for watching the Idahoan Show.